If he had given me one more week, it would have all fallen apart. I didn't have a choice, and Celeste had no idea. She's the last obstacle. And she trusts me. That is the beauty of it. Bro, I'm running out of patience. One way or the other, it will soon be over.
You spend your entire life sleeping next to a stranger. Not a stranger you never met, a stranger you chose, a stranger you loved, a stranger you trusted completely, until the night everything you thought was real collapsed into 4 words spoken through a closed door that was never meant for your ears. This is that story. And once you hear it, you will never think about the word trust the same way again. Before we go anywhere, before we take one single step deeper into this story, we want to hear from you right now. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We genuinely love knowing who is part of this community, and we read every single one. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We release stories like this one every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Marcus met Raymond Sr. for the first time over dinner at the Aldridge estate in January of 2010, 4 months into his relationship with Celeste. Celeste had not pressured the meeting. She had, in fact, been careful about it. She knew her father, knew his assessment of people was swift and final and not always kind, and she had wanted to give the relationship enough substance before placing it under Raymond's particular scrutiny. And she need not have worried in the sense that Marcus was entirely prepared. He arrived exactly on time, which Raymond Sr. respected. He was dressed well but not ostentatiously, which Raymond also respected. He engaged Raymond in a conversation about private infrastructure investment for most of the first hour of dinner, which was precisely the kind of conversation Raymond preferred to social pleasantries, and he held his own in it without performing expertise he did not have. He said things like, "I don't know enough about this sector to have a firm position, but here's how I'm thinking about it," and then offered a genuinely thoughtful framework, which Raymond found both accurate and disarming. Before dessert, Marcus looked at Raymond directly and said, "Your daughter tells me you built everything from nothing. That is the only kind of story I actually respect." Raymond looked at him. Then Raymond said, "Is that so?" and moved on to the next subject. That was the entire visible exchange. After the dinner, after Marcus had gone and the house was quiet, Raymond Sr. called Daphne Voss from the study and told her that something about the man bothered him. He could not name it, he said. It was a feeling, the feeling you got when something was performing authenticity rather than expressing it, like watching someone read from a script they had written so well they had started to believe it themselves. He said, "That man is hunting something. I think it might be my daughter." Daphne Voss, who had known Raymond for 15 years and had learned to take his instincts seriously, said she thought he was being overprotective, said that Celeste was 31 years old, said that the man had seemed, from everything she could see, like a genuine, accomplished, thoughtful person who appeared to care for Celeste. Raymond listened, nodded, said nothing further, ordered another drink, and made the decision, perhaps the most consequential decision of his life, to let it go. He told himself he was giving his daughter the room she needed. He told himself he was not going to be the kind of father who drove away the people his children chose. He told himself his instincts were possibly colored by his own difficulty with people, his own wariness, his own inability to open easily. He was wrong. His instincts were the most accurate thing he had ever felt. Yes, but he chose his daughter's happiness over his own certainty, and he let the man in. Marcus and Celeste married in September of 2011. The wedding was held at a plantation estate outside of Savannah. 300 guests, a 6-piece orchestra, flowers that Eleanor would have loved, photographs that appear in retrospect to document a beautiful lie. Raymond Sr. sat in the front row and danced with Celeste once and held her face in his hands just before the ceremony and said, "I love you. Be happy." And then he let her go. For the first 2 years of the marriage, Celeste would later say, and it is worth sitting with this carefully because it matters, things were genuinely good, not perfect. No marriage is, but real. Marcus was present and attentive and capable of the kind of warmth that, in small doses over time, makes you believe in it completely. He was funny in the particular way that clever and watchful people are funny, noticing the exact absurdity in a situation and naming it precisely and then looking at you to see if you caught it too, and when you did, making you feel like you were the only two people in the room smart enough to have noticed. He called Raymond Sr. regularly and engaged him in conversations about the company, not pushing, not overreaching, not triggering the older man's radar, or just building a relationship inch by inch the way you build a wall, one brick at a time, each one looking like nothing until you step back and see how much ground has been covered. What was happening on the operational level during those first 2 years, invisible to Celeste and invisible to Raymond's closest advisors, was a patient and systematic reconnaissance. Marcus was learning the company. Not the public-facing structure, the press releases, the board composition, said the reported revenues, but the architecture beneath it, the trust documents, the governance agreements, the succession mechanics, the legal relationships between Raymond's personal holdings and the corporate entity. He was asking questions in the specific, deferential way of a man who is learning from his father-in-law, framing every inquiry as respect rather than research. And Raymond, who had relaxed somewhat in the 2 years since the wedding, who had watched Marcus with his daughter and seen something that looked enough like genuine love that his guard had lowered by a fraction, answered those questions. Not fully. Not with the granular detail that would have raised alarms, but enough. Enough for Marcus to understand. By approximately 2013, 2 years into the marriage, exactly what stood between him and $85 billion. And what stood between him was Raymond Ellis Aldridge Sr. and a set of estate documents that had not yet been updated to account for the specific legal scenario of a son-in-law who was planning to become the controlling interest in a company he had married into. Marcus began spending more time with Nolan Fisk in 2013. Fisk was the CFO of Aldridge Global Holdings, 51 years old, 22 years with the company, and a man who had built his professional identity entirely around his proximity to Raymond's operation and who had, over 2 decades, accumulated a certain kind of institutional power that was entirely dependent on the continuation of the existing structure. Fisk was not a bad man in the blunt sense. He was not someone who had set out to participate in anything criminal. He was someone who had, over a series of conversations with Marcus Holloway that began as collegial and professional and gradually became something else entirely, been offered a version of the company's future in which his position was substantially enhanced, in which the CFO of Aldridge Global Holdings, under a Holloway-controlled governance structure, was a very different and very much more powerful and compensated figure than the CFO under Raymond Sr.'s iron-fisted family control. Marcus had not made threats, and he had made a picture of a future in which Nolan Fisk was important in a way he had never quite been allowed to be. And Fisk, who had spent 22 years being extremely competent in the service of a man who acknowledged competence without celebrating it, had looked at that picture and made a choice that he would spend the rest of his life trying to contextualize but never quite managing to justify. He began feeding Marcus information, not everything, not quickly, but selectively, to carefully, just enough. Details about trust restructuring timelines, about Raymond's estate planning conversations with Daphne Voss, about the specific legal triggers that would determine what happened to the company's governance in the event of Raymond's death. He was, in Raymond's eventual assessment, a man who had not intended to become complicit in murder, but had, through a series of incremental decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation, made himself exactly that. And the memo Fisk would later send to Daphne Voss, the one that said watch the husband, was real in the sense that Fisk had by that point genuinely become afraid of what he had helped to set in motion. But Raymond was right that it was also a document designed to create a paper trail of concerned colleague behavior. It was both things simultaneously. That is the particular complexity of Nolan Fisk. Not a monster, not a hero, but a man who chose comfort over conscience 100 small times, and then, when the cost of those choices became clear, tried to find a way to be on the right side of history before the history was finished being written. In the winter of 2015, Raymond Ellis Aldridge Sr. made a decision that he told no one about. He sat down with Daphne Voss in her office on a Tuesday morning and told her he wanted to rebuild his estate plan from the ground up. And he gave her a set of instructions that were unusual in their specificity, and that Daphne Voss would later describe in testimony as the most precise and legally sophisticated estate restructuring directives she had received from a client in 30 years of practice. Raymond knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted Celeste in direct operational control of Aldridge Global Holdings as CEO upon his death, with no requirement that she consult or defer to any spouse or proxy in executing that control. And he wanted a protective trust structure that made it legally impossible for any person who had not been born into or formally adopted into the Aldridge bloodline to claim controlling interest in the company's assets without a multi-step approval process that required Celeste's signature alone, under conditions specifically designed to prevent any form of external pressure or coercion. He wanted a fixed distribution for Marcus, generous by any ordinary standard, locked and non-negotiable, and entirely separate from any governance authority. He wanted, in other words, a wall, a legal, binding, thoroughly constructed wall between his daughter's inheritance and the man he had never stopped believing was hunting something. Daphne Voss asked him directly whether this was about Marcus. Raymond looked at her for a long moment and said, "It is about protecting Celeste," which was both an answer and not an answer. And Daphne Voss, who had known Raymond long enough to understand both registers of his communication, filed the documents without further discussion and told no one. Marcus did not know the wall had been built until after Raymond was dead, and by then, of course, it was too late for it to protect Raymond. 3 months after the new estate documents were filed, on the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2016, Raymond Ellis Aldridge Sr. was found unresponsive in his private study at the Aldridge estate in Savannah, Georgia. He was 71 years old. The call came in at 6:58 in the morning. Gloria May Trenton, the family housekeeper who had worked at the estate for 22 years, had arrived at her usual time of 6:45 and had gone to Raymond's study at 6:50 to bring him his morning coffee, as she did every day without exception, and had found him in his chair, completely still, and with the particular quality of stillness that is different from sleep, and that Gloria, who had worked around people her entire life, recognized immediately. She called for help. The Chatham County medical examiner arrived within the hour. The preliminary examination was straightforward. Raymond had a documented history of heart disease, 2 cardiac stents placed in 2013, a standing prescription for blood pressure and cardiac medications, a cardiologist's standing advisory to reduce stress that Raymond had never once followed. The cause of death was recorded as acute cardiac arrest. It was, on its surface, a plausible death. A sad one, but plausible. These things happened to men like Raymond. Men who had never slowed down, who had treated their bodies as equipment in service of their ambitions, who had been told for years that the pace they kept was not sustainable, and had continued keeping it anyway. The county signed off, and the funeral was scheduled, and Marcus Holloway, who had been notified of his father-in-law's death by phone at 7:15 that morning and had arrived at the estate by 8:30, stood beside his wife through the next several days of arrangements with the measured, composed grief of a son-in-law who had loved the man and was holding himself together for his wife's sake. He was flawless. He was present. He was, by every observable measure, exactly what he appeared to be. And that should have been the end of it. But there were 2 things that did not fit, and the first of them was Gloria May Trenton. Gloria had been with the Aldridge family since 1994. She had known Raymond when Eleanor was alive. She had known Celeste as a child. She had watched Ray grow up and leave and watched the particular absence his departure left in the house. She had known this family through every season of their life together, and she had known this house so completely. Its sounds, But its rhythms, its smells, the particular way the morning light fell through the study windows in February, that she could have navigated it blind. On the morning Raymond died, before she found him, before she called for help, before everything became a sequence of events that had its own momentum, Gloria had noticed something. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that would hold up in a courtroom on its own. It was a detail, a small, specific, out-of-place detail in Raymond's study that registered in the part of her brain that tracks the texture of a familiar environment and sends an alert when something is wrong with that texture. She could not name it precisely enough to articulate it to the medical examiner. She could not make it into evidence. She could not translate the wrongness she felt into the language of proof. And so she said nothing. She went home that evening, and she sat with it, and she said nothing. She went back to work during the family's week of mourning, and she moved through those days carrying the feeling the way you carry something you cannot put down, but also cannot bring yourself to show anyone. She told no one for 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. She would later say that she did not come forward because she was afraid and because she could not prove what she had seen. She only knew what she felt. And what she felt, standing in that study on Valentine's Day morning of 2016, was that something in that room was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with a man dying of a heart attack in his sleep. That feeling was right. She was not wrong. And the fact that she carried it alone for 4 years is one of the quiet tragedies woven into this story. The way that ordinary people in proximity to extraordinary crimes sometimes see the truth and have nowhere to put it. And the cost of that displacement is measured in years. The second thing that did not fit was the will. When Daphne Voss read the updated estate documents into the official record at the family's post-funeral legal meeting, something happened in the room. Marcus Holloway's expression shifted. The security camera mounted in the corner of the conference room, standard in any legal office handling estates of that magnitude, captured it. These investigators who reviewed the footage months later would calculate the shift at approximately 1.7 seconds. His face went somewhere else. Then it came back. The shift was not rage, and it was not grief, and it was not surprise in the way an innocent person would be surprised. It was the specific, controlled recalibration of a man who has just received information that changes his calculations and is processing that change before he allows anything to show. He asked no questions, and he thanked Daphne Voss politely. He drove Celeste home, and in the weeks that followed, he said almost nothing about the terms of the estate, which was itself the most significant thing about his behavior. A man who had spent years quietly building toward control of a company had just learned that a wall had been built around that company, and he was responding to that information with total silence. He was not protesting. He was not consulting attorneys. He was not asking questions. And he was absorbing. He was adjusting. Because Marcus Holloway, whatever else he was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who reacted before he had a plan. He was a man who had been waiting for years and who understood that patience was not a virtue, but a weapon, and who had just identified the new obstacle between himself and $85 billion. The new obstacle was his wife. For 2 years following Raymond's death, from the spring of 2016 to the fall of 2018, and Marcus Holloway conducted what investigators would later describe in the language of their case documents as a systematic campaign to gain effective operational control of Aldridge Global Holdings through a combination of legitimate advisory positioning, document manipulation, and the exploitation of his wife's trust. This is the clinical language. The human language is simpler. He watched his wife grieve her father, and he used that grief. And he was the one who sat with her through the sleepless nights in the months after the funeral. He was the one who understood the paperwork better than she did and offered to handle it. He was the one who suggested that she did not need to be in every board meeting, that she could trust his judgment on the operational details, that the company would still be there when she was ready to engage fully. Take the time you need. I will hold things together. I am here. I am not going anywhere. He said all of it in the voice of a man who loved his wife. He said it in the register of devotion. And Celeste, who was 38 years old and had just lost her father and was now responsible for running an $85 billion company she had never been trained for, who was grieving and overwhelmed and entirely unaware that the man she was leaning on had been the reason she had something to grieve. Celeste leaned. She leaned into him the way you lean into the one solid thing in a room that is otherwise moving. She shared the details he asked for. She signed the documents he placed in front of her. She trusted him the way a woman trusts her husband. And Marcus Holloway gained access, not all at once, not through any single dramatic move that would have been visible, through accumulation. A board appointment here framed as operational necessity. A legal document there is buried in language that obscured its implications. A relationship with a company lender that gave him a degree of financial leverage he had not previously possessed. A structural amendment to the company's operating agreement that appeared routine and had been processed through Nolan Fisk's office without attracting scrutiny. He was not stealing the company, he was restructuring the path to it. And by the fall of 2018, Marcus Dane Holloway was one document away from effective control. And the document was an amendment to the spousal trust, a carefully worded, professionally drafted, entirely legal-looking piece of paper that, buried in its third subsection, transferred to Marcus the operational governance authority that Raymond Sr. had so carefully stripped from him. He had asked Celeste to sign it twice. She had not refused. She had said she wanted to review it more carefully. She had said she wanted to talk to Daphne first. Each time, Marcus had smiled and said, "Of course, there is absolutely no rush." Each time, that smile had not reached his eyes. And Marcus had begun, quietly and in parallel, exploring what he described to Trevor Colt in that den on the night of October 9th as another way. Trevor Colt had known Marcus Holloway for over a decade, since they were both in their early 20s and living in the same orbit of mid-level ambition and intelligence that produces, in most cases, unremarkable professional lives. And they had remained close in the way of two people who have each seen the other's worst qualities and chosen, for reasons that are more about history than virtue, to stay. Colt had built a career in pharmaceutical logistics, supply chain management for a mid-sized drug distribution company in Atlanta, a field that was technical and detail-oriented and that kept him professionally invisible in a way that suited his temperament. He was not a flamboyant man, and he was not someone who sought attention or drama. He was, in the language of the people who would later describe him to investigators, someone who was very good at moving things from one place to another without anyone paying much notice. That quality, the invisibility of logistics, the anonymity of supply chains, was what Marcus had eventually, over years of very careful conversation, understood could be useful. The compound Marcus needed was digoxin, a cardiac medication that, though at therapeutic doses, regulated the heart rhythms of patients like Raymond Sr. who had documented cardiac conditions. At elevated doses, introduced externally in combination with Raymond's existing prescriptions, digoxin produced cardiac arrest. Post-mortem, in a preliminary examination not specifically looking for poisoning evidence in a patient with a documented heart condition, the signs were entirely consistent with natural death. Our Trevor Colt knew how to obtain the compound outside of traceable pharmaceutical channels. He knew the dosage. He knew the timing. He had, in the specific and terrible utility of his professional expertise, every piece of knowledge that this plan required. The hotel meeting in Atlanta, a private bar in a downtown hotel, February 11th, 2016, 3 days before Raymond died, lasted 40 minutes. They arrived separately. They paid cash. And they requested a room with a specific type of minibar refrigeration that no one at the hotel thought to question, because hotel bar customers request all manner of things and nobody logs the reasons. They left separately. 3 days later, Raymond Aldridge Sr. was dead, and Trevor Colt went home to Atlanta and moved through the next 2 years, trying not to think about what he had done, which is the particular corrosive way that guilt works on people who are not psychopaths, not cleanly, and not with resolution, but as a slow contamination of everything that is not yet ruined. There had been a prior incident. This is the detail that, when it eventually came to light, changed the scale and scope of what investigators understood they were dealing with. In 2014, 2 years before Raymond's death, and Marcus Holloway had attempted to use a similar pharmaceutical approach against a business partner in Atlanta, a man named only as a cooperating witness in the case documents, who had been threatening to expose a fraudulent element of one of Marcus's private equity structures. The partner had, by pure accident, survived. He had taken a different over-the-counter medication that morning for a sinus infection. There's a medication whose interaction with the compound produced immediate nausea and vomiting rather than the cardiac suppression Marcus had intended. The partner had attributed the episode to food poisoning. He had called Marcus 2 days later to say he had been sick. Marcus had expressed concern and sympathy. The threat to expose the fraud had, in the weeks that followed, been resolved through other means, financial means, at the kind of settlement that requires a non-disclosure agreement and is very rarely examined further. The partner had moved on. He had never connected the food poisoning to Marcus. He was alive. He was in Atlanta. He had no idea that any of this was connected to anything. Until the phone rang, and the federal agents told him what they had found, and he sat down in the nearest available chair and put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. October 9th, 2018. A Tuesday evening. Marcus had told Celeste he had some friends coming to watch a football game. One of those domestic arrangements so ordinary, so entirely unremarkable, that it would not have registered as anything in the memory of anyone who was not paying close attention. Celeste had a migraine. She had been managing it since the afternoon. She took her medication around 8:30, said goodnight to Marcus and his guests, Trevor Colt and 2 other men she recognized from Marcus's social circle, and went upstairs. She was asleep by 9. At 11:40 in the evening, she woke up. The medication had worn off. The migraine had eased to a dull pressure rather than the sharp, focused pain of earlier. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the quiet of the house, and then decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. She did not turn on the bedside lamp. She did not want to wake herself fully. She moved down the hallway and to the stairs in the dark, the way you move in a house you have lived in long enough to navigate by memory alone, your body knowing the spaces without instruction from your eyes. She was at the bottom of the stairs when she heard the sound of Marcus's laugh from behind the closed study door. That particular laugh she had come to know over 7 years of marriage, the one that had started to feel, in recent months, like a performance rather than a response, like a sound produced for effect rather than from feeling, though she had not allowed herself to name that impression before now. She heard Trevor Colt say something she could not make out. She was about to push through the kitchen door to get her water when she heard Marcus say her father's name. Raymond. Just like that. Casual, unremarkable, the way you say the name of something that has already been taken care of. She stopped. Her hand was on the kitchen door. She took her hand off the kitchen door. She pressed herself against the wall, and she listened. She heard Marcus say that Raymond had known, that in the final weeks of his life, Raymond had been circling, getting close, figuring out enough to be dangerous. She heard him say that Daphne Voss had been starting to ask questions. She heard him say, and this is the sentence that would be read aloud in a courtroom 2 years later, that would be described in case files and news coverage and eventually in the kinds of documents that outlast everyone involved in a story. She heard Marcus say, if he had been given 1 more week, everything falls apart. She heard him say, I didn't have a choice. She heard Trevor Colt ask whether she had any idea, and she heard her husband, in that same easy, comfortable, unhurried voice, the voice she had believed was her safe place. The voice she had listened to in the dark for 7 years, she heard that man say that she was the last obstacle, that her trust was the beauty of it, that he was running out of patience, that one way or another, it was almost over. Celeste Wren Aldridge stood in the dark hallway for 4 minutes. She did not make a sound. She did not move. She was not performing stillness. She had become it, the way your body sometimes makes decisions before your mind catches up. In the way survival instinct can look from the outside like extraordinary composure. Then she moved. She walked back upstairs in the dark, in the same silence she had come down in. She got into bed. She listened to the sound of her own breathing in the dark room, and she did not sleep. What Celeste Wren Aldridge did over the next 72 hours is the part of this story that investigators, prosecutors, legal analysts, and the jurors who would eventually hear her testimony all described with a version of the same word. Some called it remarkable. Some called it extraordinary. Some simply said they had never seen anything quite like it. And what they meant by all of those words was this: a woman who had just learned, in the most direct and irreversible possible way, that her husband had killed her father and was planning to kill her. That woman went to sleep, or lay still enough to simulate sleep. Or she got up the next morning and made breakfast. She sat across the kitchen table from Marcus Holloway and asked him how the game had gone and whether Trevor had stayed late, and she listened to him answer, and she passed him the coffee, and she said she was thinking of spending the day at the nonprofit office, and he said that sounded nice. And she drove to the nonprofit office, walked in the front door, said good morning to her staff with whatever quality of normalcy she managed to produce from whatever reserve she was drawing on, and then walked out the back. She drove 20 minutes to a gas station. She found a payphone, one of the last functioning ones in that part of Georgia, a detail that would strike investigators later as the kind of specific, deliberate preparedness that does not come from panic, but from a mind working at full capacity under the most extreme possible pressure. She called Daphne Voss. She used no phone that Marcus could have monitored. She had understood in those 4 minutes in the dark hallway that the man she was married to was someone who planned, who monitored, who left nothing to chance, and that surviving this would require her to become, for however long it took, the version of herself that he believed her to be. Trusting, unaware, safe. She told Daphne Voss everything she had heard, in precise sequential order. Daphne Voss was silent on the other end of the line for so long that Celeste asked if she was still there. Then Daphne said, "We need to be very careful." Celeste said, "I know." And then she told Daphne about the safe. Raymond's private safe was in a location in the estate that Marcus had never been shown. Raymond had shown it to Celeste years earlier, before the marriage, in the particular indirect way he had of preparing her for things he could not bring himself to say directly. And he had taken her to the location, shown her the combination, shown her what was inside, the journals, the original trust documents, personal financial records maintained separately from anything in the official estate files, and he had said, "This is for you, only you. If anything ever happens that doesn't make sense, start here." Celeste had not thought about the safe in years. There had never seemed to be a reason to. Now she understood that her father had known, and in the specific and terrible way of a man whose instincts were always right and who had not acted on them in time, and that he had prepared for the possibility that they would someday be needed. She went to the safe that afternoon while Marcus was at a meeting in the city. She opened it. She found the journals. She found the original documents. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, she found a sealed envelope in Raymond's handwriting. 4 words on the front. "Only if something happens." She did not open it immediately. She secured the contents of the safe in a location Marcus could not access and went home and made dinner and sat across the table from her husband and said, "I think I slept better last night." He said, "Good." He squeezed her hand. She smiled at him. She had become, in the space of 24 hours, a woman she did not entirely recognize. She was grateful for it. She understood that this woman, this calm, unreadable, inapparently trusting woman, was the only version of herself that was going to survive what came next. The second call Celeste made during those 72 hours was from a burner phone she purchased with cash at a convenience store 25 miles from the estate, paying with small bills, not looking at the clerk, wearing a hat she almost never wore. She called her brother Ray. She had not spoken to him in 7 years. Not a fight, not a rupture, and simply the accumulated distance of a family that had never learned to maintain connection through difficulty, two people who loved each other and had run out of the particular kind of courage that ordinary closeness requires. He answered on the third ring, his voice careful and uncertain, because this number was unknown and his sister almost never called without warning. She said, "Ray, Dad was murdered. Marcus did it. I need you." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Celeste to wonder if the call had dropped. She heard Ray breathing. Then he said simply, "Tell me where you are." He was in his car within the hour. He drove from Charleston to a meeting point Celeste had selected, a parking lot near a strip mall on the edge of Savannah, the kind of unremarkable, anonymous location that has no association with the Aldridge family and would not be noted by anyone who might be watching. That they sat in his car for 2 hours. She told him everything. He asked questions with the particular directness of someone who has heard a thing so enormous that there is no point in responding to it with normal social hedging. He did not say, "Are you sure?" He did not say, "That can't be right," he asked. "What do you need? And what do I do?" That was the conversation. That was what 7 years of distance dissolved into. A parking lot, a quiet night. They sent two siblings who had never quite managed to be close enough to each other, and who were, in the most terrible possible circumstances, finally being close enough. Ray did not return to Charleston. He got a room in a hotel in Savannah under a name that was not his own and waited for further instruction. He would stay in that room for 9 days. The third thing Celeste did in those 72 hours was contact Detective Harold Briggs. She had met Briggs once, briefly, and at a charity event 3 years earlier. A semi-retired homicide detective introduced through a mutual acquaintance, a man she had spoken to for perhaps 15 minutes, about Savannah history and local architecture. She had remembered him, not dramatically, not with the kind of clarity that you remember people who change your life, but with the low, steady quality of someone who had registered as genuine in a world full of performance. She remembered the way he listened. Then not the performed listening of someone constructing a response while you speak, but the actual thing. The stillness of a man who had learned over decades that what people almost say is usually more important than what they say. She trusted him without being able to explain why, which, given what she had recently learned about the dangers of trust, was not a thing she took lightly. She called him from the burner phone. She asked to meet. He said when and where. She said a grocery store parking lot in Pooler, Georgia, at 11 the following morning. He was there at 10:45. She sat in the passenger seat of his sedan and told him everything, in the same precise, sequential order she had used with Daphne Voss, and Harold Briggs listened without interrupting. He asked 4 questions when she was done, all of them procedural, none of them about whether she was certain, none of them about whether she was okay. Because he understood from 30 years of homicide investigation that a woman who sits in a stranger's car and delivers this information in this manner is both certain and not okay, and does not need to be asked either question. He told her what he would need. He told her that the most important thing she could do right now was continue to appear to Marcus exactly as she had always appeared. She nodded. He said, "You understand what that means." She said, "I understand what that means." He looked at her for a moment and said, "How are you doing with this?" She said, "I will do that after." He did not push. He came out of retirement that afternoon. Harold Briggs had spent 30 years in homicide, the last decade of his active career focused on what he called comfortable deaths, cases where someone with power or money or connections died at a convenient moment, and everyone around them exhaled a little too easily, and the official record closed a little too fast. Oh, he had a nose for it, not the dramatic murder, the obvious violence, the crime of passion, the body that announces itself. He was drawn to the deaths that looked like nothing. The man who died of a heart attack 3 months after his will was changed. The woman whose accident happened when her insurance had just been doubled. The natural causes that assembled themselves with a precision that nature, alone, does not usually manage. He had retired 3 years before Celeste called him. Or tried to retire, which was not the same thing. He had a house on the Georgia coast and a boat he went out on regularly, and a stack of novels he worked through with modest consistency, and none of it had fully displaced the particular restlessness of a man who had spent 3 decades being useful in a specific, irreplaceable way, and was now supposed to be fine with being ordinary. Raymond Aldridge's obituary had bothered him from the moment he read it. Not because he knew the family, but because the timing was too perfect. Men like Raymond, men who had spent 50 years in a state of permanent operational intensity, who had never once in their professional lives done the convenient thing, did not die at convenient moments. Something convenient had killed him. That was what Harold Briggs had thought, reading the obituary over his morning coffee in his coastal kitchen, and then he had set the newspaper down and thought, "Not my case," and gone about his day. It was his case now, and he felt, sitting across from Celeste Aldridge in that grocery store parking lot, the particular stillness he had learned over 30 years to recognize. The stillness that meant, this is real. He drove home. He spread his notes across the kitchen table. He called the original medical examiner before dinner. The M.E. had certified Raymond's death as cardiac arrest, which was accurate in the sense that his heart had stopped. It was the why of the stopping that was in question. The M.E. had noted 2 minor anomalies in the toxicology, trace irregularities that had been attributed at the time to Raymond's prescribed cardiac medications and recorded as clinically unremarkable, consistent with his medication history, warranting no further examination. Looking at those anomalies now, through the framework of what Celeste had told him, Briggs called a forensic toxicologist at a university in Atlanta, a professor who had published extensively on the subject of cardiac glycoside toxicity, including a paper specifically addressing the difficulty of post-mortem identification of digoxin excess in patients with pre-existing cardiac conditions. The toxicologist walked Briggs through the pharmacology carefully. Digoxin, at therapeutic doses, was life-sustaining for patients with certain cardiac conditions. At elevated doses, introduced externally and timed in combination with specific other compounds that slowed the body's ability to process and excrete the medication, it produced exactly the cardiac arrest profile that Raymond's medical records documented. Post-mortem, in a preliminary examination conducted without specific suspicion of poisoning, the indicators were, the toxicologist chose her words precisely, almost entirely consistent with natural death. Briggs wrote down the word almost. He circled it twice. And that word was the crack in the wall. That word was where everything that came next was going to enter. Briggs spent the following 48 hours making requests and cross-referencing records through channels that bypassed the normal investigative bureaucracy, the prerogative of a retired detective with 30 years of relationships and a case that could not yet be made official without tipping off the subject. He contacted pharmaceutical licensing boards in 3 states, and he cross-referenced Trevor Colt's professional employment history and supply chain involvement over the previous 10 years with records of flagged transactions and licensing irregularities. He found them. Not cleanly, not in any single database that would have made the connection obvious, but distributed across 3 separate regulatory filings that had been processed by different agencies in different years and that had each been resolved with minor administrative penalties and no further follow-up, because no one had ever had a reason to look at them together. Trevor Colt had, on 3 documented occasions between 2013 and 2015, been involved in the movement of pharmaceutical compounds outside of properly licensed channels, the kind of violation that, in the context of supply chain management for a mid-sized distributor, looked like paperwork irregularity rather than criminal intent, and that had been treated accordingly. In the context of a murder investigation, they were something else entirely. Then Briggs found the hotel receipt. Atlanta, a downtown hotel. February 11th, 2016. The room request with the specific minibar refrigeration. In the cash payment that had nonetheless been logged in the hotel's system because the room had been booked through a phone number, a prepaid number, already canceled, that linked back to a purchasing pattern Briggs spent 3 hours tracing before it connected, at 3 in the morning on his kitchen table with his third cup of coffee, to a name: Trevor Colt. 3 days before Raymond Aldridge died. Marcus Holloway and Trevor Colt in a hotel room in Atlanta, cash, specific equipment, on 3 days before a 71-year-old man with a heart condition died of cardiac arrest. It was not yet a case, but it was the shape of a case, and Briggs had seen enough shapes in 30 years to know when the outline was right. He also found the prior incident. This is the detail that surprised even Briggs, the detail that suggested the hotel meeting had not been a first experiment, but a refinement of an approach that Marcus had already attempted. The business partner in Atlanta. The 2014 episode that had been recorded nowhere as anything other than a business dispute settled privately. Briggs found the partner through a chain of financial records connected to one of Marcus's earlier private equity structures and reached him on a Thursday morning and said he was investigating a matter connected to a former business associate and asked if they could speak. But the partner, who had spent 6 years not entirely comfortable with the memory of a very strange illness on a very convenient day, said yes. He met Briggs at a coffee shop. Briggs laid out what he had. The partner sat across from him and said, "I thought it was food poisoning." He said it twice. Then he said, "I always thought the timing was strange." Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" He gave Briggs a signed statement that afternoon. The case against Marcus Holloway had just acquired a prior pattern of conduct. And in federal prosecution, prior pattern of conduct is not a secondary detail. It is the difference between an isolated incident and a methodology, between a crime and a character. While Briggs was assembling the case, Celeste was still in the house, still waking up beside Marcus every morning. Still making coffee and reviewing board documents and attending nonprofit meetings and returning Marcus's calls and giving no indication, not a single visible crack in the surface of her performed normalcy, that anything had changed. She was in the house for 10 days after the hallway, 10 days of ordinary Tuesday mornings and ordinary Wednesday evenings, and the particular horror of ordinary life sustained over a foundation that had been completely destroyed. And she would later describe those 10 days as the longest of her life, longer than the 72 hours immediately after, longer than the trial, longer than anything she could compare them to. Not because of fear, she said, though there was fear, because of grief. Because she was grieving her father while standing beside the man who had killed him, grieving her marriage while performing it, grieving the version of herself that had existed before that hallway and could not now be recovered. And she was doing all of that grieving alone, in silence, with her face arranged to show nothing. And it was, she said this quietly without drama, the hardest thing she had ever done. Daphne Voss had told her to hold for 24 hours. Briggs had told her to hold. She held. She held for 10 days. She held until Briggs told her it was close enough that she needed to be ready to move when he gave the signal. She prepared quietly, a small bag, packed and hidden in the garden shed, containing the documents she had secured from the safe, and a change of clothes and a phone she had not yet activated. She memorized a route from the estate to a service road at the back of the property. She identified the window in the guest bathroom that opened easily and dropped 6 feet to a garden bed below. She did all of it with the methodical precision of someone who has accepted the full reality of a situation and is no longer spending any energy on disbelieving it. She was ready. Now, on the evening of October 19th, 10 days after the hallway, Marcus came home from a dinner meeting. He poured 2 glasses of wine. He brought one to Celeste in the sitting room. He sat across from her. And then, in the particular, calm, deliberate register of a man who has decided the performance is over, he said, "You found the safe, didn't you? Your father's safe." He was not asking. He was telling her what he knew, and the way you tell someone something when you have already decided what the next step is, and you are simply giving them the information to calibrate their response. He looked at her and smiled, not warmly. The other smile, the one she had only started seeing in recent months, the one that had no feeling behind it, the one that was simply a calculation wearing the shape of an expression. Celeste looked at her husband, at the man she had loved, at the man who had killed her father, at the man who had decided she was an obstacle, and she set down the glass of wine she had not touched. She said she thought she would call it an early night. She stood up. She walked upstairs. She closed the bathroom door behind her. She opened the window. She dropped 6 feet to the garden below, landed on the soft earth of the flower bed, did not pause, and ran. The bag was in the shed. She retrieved it in 15 seconds. She moved through the garden to the tree line at the back of the property. She walked through the trees to the service road. The sedan was parked at the far end, engine off, no lights. Harold Briggs was in the driver's seat with a thermos of coffee and a paperback he had not been reading. He had been there for 45 minutes. He started the engine without saying anything. She got in. Neither of them spoke for several miles. Then Briggs said, "You okay?" She said, "I will be." And he nodded and drove. Marcus Holloway was arrested at 6:42 in the morning at Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport. Gate B7, Zurich, direct 8:15 departure. He was standing at the gate with his boarding pass in his hand, dressed immaculately, carry-on bag at his feet, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a flight. The bag contained $2.3 million in bundled cash, and his jacket pocket contained documents pre-positioning his personal assets into an offshore trust structure. He had, even in his exit, been precise. He had planned the escape with the same patient, systematic thoroughness he had brought to everything else, the cash assembled over months in amounts small enough to avoid reporting thresholds, the offshore structure established through a series of legal intermediaries that would have taken investigators months to unravel, and the international destination chosen for its extradition complexity. He had not planned for Celeste. He had not planned for the possibility that the woman he had spent years managing would, in the space of 10 days, dismantle everything he had built before he could finish what he had started. The federal agents approached him at the gate. He watched them come. He did not move. He did not run. He did not argue or raise his voice or perform surprise. He looked at the lead agent. I adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, a gesture so practiced and so characteristic of his particular composure that she would mention it in her later testimony, and said, "I would like to speak with my attorney." Those were the last words Marcus Dane Holloway said voluntarily to anyone outside of privileged legal conversations for the next 8 months. They were also, in retrospect, the most honest words he had spoken in years. They were the words of a man who knew exactly what was happening, which was the only thing about Marcus Holloway that never changed. He always knew exactly what was happening. He had simply, for the first time, been unable to prevent it. Trevor Colt was arrested 2 hours later at his home in Atlanta. He answered the door in his bathrobe. He looked at the agents and said, "What do I need to do?" He had a cooperation agreement signed within 72 hours. What he told prosecutors in the debriefing sessions that followed, 64 pages of testimony sealed at the time, and only partially released in the years since, was, by the lead prosecutor's account, the most comprehensive and voluntary confession she had received from a cooperating witness in 20 years. It was not reluctant testimony, dragged out in increments. It was a man who had been carrying something he could not carry anymore, putting it down with both hands on a table in a federal building and saying, "Here it is. All of it. Everything. The hotel meeting, the compound, the 3 years of planning before Raymond's death, the prior attempt in 2014, the conversations about Celeste, the timeline for what had been planned, the specific, chronological, fully detailed account of every decision, every step, every action." Trevor Colt cried twice during the initial debriefing, not when he described Raymond's death. when he described the moment years earlier when he had realized that what Marcus was proposing had moved from abstract to concrete, and he had not said no. He cried when he said, "I should have said no. That's the thing. I should have just said no." He cried for himself, which was an honest kind of crying. He had been a man who had the chance to stop something and had not stopped it, and he was going to spend a very long time in prison knowing that. And the prosecutor said later that she thought the crying was real, which did not make him sympathetic, she clarified, but which made him human. There was a difference. She was not always sure people understood the difference. Nolan Fisk was arrested on a Tuesday morning 11 days before he was scheduled to testify as a supporting witness for the prosecution, and the arrest came from Raymond's letter. The sealed envelope Celeste had retrieved from the bottom of her father's safe and that she had held through all 10 days in the house and through the arrest and through the first weeks of what followed, waiting for the moment when she could read it without the reading breaking her. She had opened it alone on the night she left the estate, and sitting in the back of Briggs's car in a parking lot somewhere in rural Georgia, while Briggs made phone calls from outside. She had read the personal section first. Then she had read the section Raymond had written about Fisk. Then she had read the personal section again. She had given Briggs the Fisk section the following morning. Everything about the letter's account of Fisk was documented, the specific dates of financial disclosures that should not have left his office. So the correlation between those disclosures and observable changes in Marcus's behavior and positioning. The precise legal language of the trust amendments that bore Fisk's processing signature and that could only have been structured the way they were structured if someone with intimate knowledge of Raymond's estate mechanics had provided that knowledge to the person drafting them. Raymond had not had a smoking gun. He had had a pattern so detailed and so precisely documented that it constituted, or in the assessment of the federal prosecutors who reviewed it, something only marginally short of a smoking gun. Something that, paired with what Colt's testimony was providing from the other direction, closed the gap entirely. Fisk was arrested. He wept in the hallway outside the processing room. He said he had been going to come forward. He said he had been going to tell them everything before the trial. Nobody believed him, because that is what people say. But his attorney came to the prosecution 3 days later with documentation. A contact, made the previous spring, before Celeste had discovered anything, before Briggs had come out of retirement, between Fisk and a private attorney in which Fisk had disclosed, under attorney-client confidentiality, that he had information about potential criminal activity connected to the Aldridge estate. The attorney had counseled him to say nothing publicly while the legal exposure was assessed. And the timeline was real. The documentation was real. It did not make Fisk innocent of what he had participated in, but it made him something harder to categorize than simply a co-conspirator. It made him a man who had, at some point before the walls came down, tried to find a door out and had been given the wrong directions. The prosecution offered a reduced plea. Fisk took it, and his testimony on the financial architecture of what Marcus had constructed inside the company was the third pillar of a prosecution case that the lead attorney described, in a private conversation with Harold Briggs, as the most structurally complete inheritance fraud and murder case she had prepared in her career. The trial of Marcus Dane Holloway opened on a Monday in June, in a Chatham County courtroom that had been reorganized twice to accommodate the volume of media presence. And it was being covered nationally and had acquired the quality that very few true crime cases develop, the quality of feeling both exceptional and entirely universal simultaneously, the story of something so extreme it should be unrecognizable and yet containing at its center something that every person who has ever loved someone recognizes completely. The prosecution's case was built on 4 pillars: Trevor Colt's testimony, the hotel documentation and pharmaceutical supply chain records, and the toxicology findings, confirmed now by 2 independent experts, including tissue sample analysis from preserved biological material retained from Raymond's autopsy, showing digoxin accumulation inconsistent with therapeutic dosage and consistent with externally introduced excess in the 72 hours preceding death. And Celeste. Celeste Wren Aldridge took the stand on the fourth day of trial. She was composed in the specific, I-earned way of someone who has been through something that makes performance unnecessary. Not performing composure, but inhabiting it, the way people do when they have already spent everything on surviving the actual event and have nothing left to spend on appearing to have survived it. She answered questions directly and without decoration. When the prosecutor asked her to describe what she had heard in the hallway on October 9th, the courtroom went quiet, in the way that only happens when every person in a room simultaneously stops performing their own presence and simply listens. Celeste looked at the jury, not at Marcus. She had looked at Marcus once, when she first entered the courtroom. A single look of 3 or 4 seconds that the journalists present would spend considerable energy describing, and then she had not looked at him again, and she described, in exact sequential order, had everything she had heard through that mahogany door, the words, the pauses, the sound of his voice, the ease of it, the absence of anything that resembled doubt. She said, he sounded like a man who had made peace with what he had done. The jury heard it the way she said it, plainly, precisely, without performance, and that plainness was its own testimony. It said, I am not dramatizing this. This is simply what it was. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination and asked whether Celeste had any way to prove that Marcus's words had not been drunken exaggeration, hyperbolic venting rather than confession, the kind of dark fantasy that resentful people sometimes perform in private, Celeste waited 2 seconds before answering. Then she said, my father changed his will 3 months before he died because he was afraid of my husband. Oh, my father built a legal wall around everything he owned specifically to keep my husband away from it. And 3 months later, my father was dead. My husband was not exaggerating. He never exaggerated. He only ever did exactly what he had decided to do. The defense attorney thanked her and sat down. There was nothing else to ask that would help. The defense's strategy was not what court observers had expected. Yet the lead defense attorney, a nationally recognized criminal defense lawyer who had been retained at significant cost and who had built a career on creating reasonable doubt in cases that appeared airtight, made the decision not to contest the most damaging facts of the prosecution's case. He did not deny the hotel meeting. He did not deny that Marcus had spoken the words Celeste described, and he accepted both as true and built the entire defense around 2 arguments that operated on a different level entirely. The first was that the words Celeste heard were the performance of a man in his cups, speaking recklessly to a friend about a father-in-law he had resented, constructing a narrative of agency over a death that had been natural and had simply happened to benefit him in ways he had not planned for. People say dark things in private, the attorney argued, that people fantasize about the elimination of obstacles. People perform a version of events in which they were powerful and decisive rather than simply grieving and overwhelmed. That is not confession, that is being human in the dark. The second argument was the toxicology. The defense had retained its own forensic toxicologist, who testified that the digoxin accumulation in Raymond's tissue samples, while anomalous, was not definitively outside the range of what could have resulted from a prescribing adjustment in the final weeks of his treatment. An adjustment that the original cardiologist under oath acknowledged he could not entirely rule out as having been recommended in a manner that was not formally documented. The word the cardiologist used under cross-examination was possible, not likely, not probable, but possible. The defense attorney said the word possible 11 times in his closing argument, and he said it more than any other word. He was trying to create a space inside that word large enough for reasonable doubt to live. The closing argument lasted 4 hours. When it was over, 2 jurors were visibly uncertain. The jury began deliberating on a Thursday afternoon. The 9 days of deliberation were, for everyone connected to the case, a particular kind of suspended reality in which nothing could be decided or resolved or put down. Celeste sat in the courthouse corridor every day, And in the same chair, with Harold Briggs reading a newspaper beside her and Ray Aldridge on her other side, and Daphne Voss checking her phone at regular intervals and not quite managing to maintain the reassuring expression she was attempting. On the 9th day of deliberation, at 2 in the afternoon, the jury sent a note to the judge. The attorneys were recalled. The note was read. Orwit asked, "Can we convict on the murder charge if we are not unanimously certain of the physical method, but are unanimously certain of intent?" Judge Clara Weston called a recess. She read the note again. She called the attorneys to the bench. The lead prosecutor, who had been doing this for 23 years, said later that she felt, reading that note, the specific sensation of standing on ground that is vibrating without yet knowing whether what is coming is an earthquake or something passing. Daphne Voss leaned over to Celeste in the corridor when the note's contents were relayed and said, "Either we just won or we just lost everything." She did not know which. She was, in that moment, being entirely honest. The judge returned to the courtroom. She provided the jury with additional instructions on the legal standard for intent in first-degree murder. She did not directly answer the question. She could not, but she provided the framework within which the jury could find its own answer. The jury returned to the deliberation room. They deliberated for 4 more hours. Then they came back. The foreperson was a retired school teacher from Effingham County, 63 years old, who would later describe the 9 days of deliberation as the most serious work she had done in her life. She stood when the judge asked whether the jury had reached verdicts. She said, "We have." She read from the form. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Raymond Ellis Aldridge, Sr., guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in concert with Trevor Allen Colt, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder of Celeste Wren Aldridge, guilty. On all counts of financial fraud and criminal conspiracy to defraud the Aldridge estate, guilty on all counts. See, Marcus Holloway stood for every count with his hands at his sides and his expression entirely neutral, and he received the word guilty 7 times with no visible reaction. No grief, no rage, no fear, no anything. The only movement in him across all 7 counts was the single barely perceptible shift in his jaw when the final guilty was read, and it became definitive, and there was nothing left to calculate. When the judge remanded him and the bailiff moved to take his arm, Marcus did one thing. He turned. Across the width of the courtroom, through all the bodies between them, he looked at Celeste Aldridge. He looked at her for 3 seconds, not with hatred, which is what the journalist had expected to write, not with defiance, with something that the people who later described the moment consistently struggled to name. The closest anyone got was this. He looked at her with something that resembled recognition, like he was seeing her, the real her, the one who had stood in the hallway and then gone back to bed, the one who had made breakfast the next morning, the one who had built the case while living inside the house, like he was seeing her for the first time. Like in the 7 years of marriage and the 3 years of planning and all the careful management of her trust, he had never quite understood who she actually was. And now he did. And now it was too late. Celeste held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. And it was over. Except that it was not over. Not for Celeste. Not in the way that the word over implies. The end of something. The return to something resembling before. There is no before. There is only after, and the work of learning how to live in it. 3 things happened after the verdict that completed this story. Not in the courtroom, not in the newspapers, quietly and in private, and in places that have no cameras. The first was the sentencing. Marcus Holloway was sentenced by Judge Clara Weston to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Consecutive terms, the maximum available on the murder counts, combined with additional terms on the fraud convictions. Judge Weston said, in delivering the sentence, that she had sat through many cases in her career involving the intersection of wealth and violence, and that the characteristic of this case that distinguished it from all of them was not the scale of the greed, but the scale of the patience. She said, "This court has rarely seen a plan this deliberate, executed over this length of time, involving this degree of sustained deception of a person who had placed in you her complete trust." She looked at Marcus when she said it. He received her words the same way he had received the jury's verdict, with total stillness, with that particular quality of composure that some people experience as strength and others as the most chilling thing they have ever been in the presence of. He said nothing in response to the sentence. His attorney said they would appeal. The appeal went nowhere. Trevor Colt received 22 years under his cooperation agreement. Nolan Fisk received 8 years on his guilty plea. Now, on the morning Marcus was transferred to the state correctional facility that would hold him for the rest of his life, Harold Briggs drove to the coast and went fishing. He had declined every interview request, there were hundreds of them, without exception. He caught 3 fish that morning and released them all. The second thing that happened after the verdict was the letter. Celeste had held Raymond's sealed envelope through the entirety of the trial, had carried it, metaphorically, through every day of testimony and every night of waiting, had known it was there and had not opened it because she could not afford to be undone by it while the case was still live and required everything she had. The night after the verdict, alone in the estate for the first time since Marcus had been taken away, she opened it. She sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had made breakfast for her husband 10 days after the Holloway, and where she had passed him his coffee and asked about the football game with a face that showed nothing. And she read her father's letter. The legal section was at the front, and it was about Fisk, and she had already given that to the investigators. The personal section was at the back. And what Raymond Aldridge Sr. had written to his daughter in the weeks when he had known, in his particular bone-deep way, that the man in her house was going to kill him. What he had written was not primarily about Marcus. It was about a secret Raymond had carried for 35 years. In the mid-1980s, before he had met Eleanor, Raymond had been in a relationship with a woman named Patricia, who was from Brunswick, Georgia, and who was kind and uncomplicated, and who had loved him in the direct, generous way that Raymond had never entirely known how to receive and had, eventually, walked away from. And he had ended the relationship when his career had begun requiring things of him that did not accommodate the kind of life Patricia needed. She had been pregnant. He had not known. She had not told him. She had given birth in the fall of 1985 to a daughter, a girl she named Iris because she loved them, and because it was a name that was both soft and strong, and she had wanted her daughter to be both. Raymond had learned of Iris's existence 4 years later through a mutual acquaintance, when the child was 4 years old. He had contacted Patricia. She had not wanted him in the child's life. Not bitterly, not with anger, but with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who understood that a man who had walked away once was not the father her daughter needed. Raymond had respected that. And he had done, from that distance, the only thing he could think of to do. He had watched. He had found ways, anonymous and untraceable, to fund Iris's education, her small business, her life, and he had built her a life from a distance without her knowing who had built it. He had done it out of guilt and out of love and out of the specific tortured accounting of a man who knows he made a choice he cannot undo and who tries, in the only way available to him, to make the cost less. He had never told Iris. He had never told Eleanor. He had never told Celeste. Until, in the weeks before his death, he had decided that at 71 years old, he could not die carrying this. He had made contact with Iris, carefully, slowly, the way you approach something you have been afraid of for decades. He had met with her once. He had told her some of it. He had told her that if anything happened to him, she should find Celeste, that Celeste would know what to do. He had told Marcus about Iris. This is the detail that had been invisible until the letter, and that, when it became visible, made the architecture of the motive fully legible for the first time. And Raymond had told Marcus about Iris in a moment of old man honesty, the kind of honesty that comes to people who feel themselves running out of time and can no longer maintain the weight of everything they have kept. He had told Marcus in what he had almost immediately recognized as a mistake, because he had watched Marcus's face change as the implications of an additional heir became clear. An heir introduced into the Aldridge estate would have forced a restructuring of the trust. A restructuring requiring independent legal review, external oversight, a process that would have made everything Marcus had been quietly building impossible to sustain. Marcus had known about Iris. He had known that Raymond was planning to acknowledge her. He had understood, with the particular cold, calculating intelligence that was the defining characteristic of everything he did, that Iris alive and acknowledged was a problem. Raymond had made contact with her. Raymond had set the timeline. And Marcus had decided that Raymond needed to die before that timeline reached its end. The motive was not only greed, it was the elimination of a specific complication. A woman who had never asked to exist, who was living her ordinary life 40 miles from the Aldridge estate, who had spent 33 years not knowing who her father was, and who had been made, by the choices of the men around her, into the catalyst for her father's murder without ever once being consulted. But Celeste read all of this at the kitchen table. Then she put the letter down. Then she sat in the quiet of the house for a long time. Then she got up, made tea, and made a plan. She found Iris on a Thursday in November. She drove herself. She did not bring Daphne Voss. She did not bring Ray, though he had offered. She did not bring Harold Briggs, though she suspected he would have come. She drove alone to Brunswick, Georgia, to a quiet residential street in a neighborhood that was modest and well-kept and entirely ordinary, and she parked in front of a house with a small front garden and a porch light on in the early afternoon gray. She sat in the car for a few minutes, not gathering courage. She was past the point where what she was doing required courage. She was simply letting herself arrive at the moment before the moment. She had learned in the past several months to do that, had to let things be what they were going to be before she reached for them. Then she got out of the car and walked to the door and knocked. Iris answered on the second knock. She was 33 years old. She had Raymond's eyes. That specific, watchful quality, the feeling that the person behind them was seeing considerably more than they were letting on. She had her mother's softness, too, the openness around the mouth, the quality of face that does not have a wall up. She looked at the woman on her porch with a polite uncertainty that said, "I don't know you, but I'm not afraid of you." Celeste said, "My name is Celeste Aldridge. I think Raymond Aldridge Sr. was my father. I believe he was your father, too. I'm sorry to do this at your front door." Iris looked at her for a long time. Then she stepped back and opened the door and said, "Please come in." They sat at Iris's kitchen table for 3 hours. Celeste told her everything, and Iris was quiet through most of it. Not a cold quiet, but the quiet of someone receiving information that is large and sharp and that requires all available attention to hold properly. She asked questions when she needed to. She cried once, briefly, near the end, and then steadied herself with the particular recognizable composure of a woman who had learned, somewhere along the way, not to fall apart in front of strangers. Celeste recognized it. She had the same quality, but she thought, "We got that from him." Then Iris told Celeste about the last time she had seen Raymond, the week before he died. She described it carefully, how he had been gentle and a little frightened, how he had talked around the edges of things he seemed to want to say more directly. She said he had seemed to her like a man who was finishing something, like a man making sure certain things were in order before he left. At the door, just before he went, and he had taken both of her hands, this man she had only recently been told was her father, this man she did not yet know how to call by any name, and he had said, "You are the thing I got right, even when I got everything else wrong." Then he had looked at her and said, "If anything happens, find Celeste. She'll know what to do." He had trusted Celeste. In the weeks when he knew what was coming and could not stop it, Raymond Aldridge Sr. had trusted his daughter to find the thing he could not finish, to find Iris, to bring together what he had spent 35 years keeping apart, out of guilt, out of fear, out of the specific damage that powerful men do to the people around them, when they are afraid of what they feel. He had trusted Celeste to do what he had not been able to do while he was alive. She had done it. On a Thursday in November, at a kitchen table in Brunswick, Georgia, with the afternoon light going gray outside the window and 2 cups of tea going cold between them, she had done it. The legal process of formally establishing Iris's standing as Raymond Aldridge's biological heir took 14 months and involved enough paperwork to fill several filing cabinets in Daphne Voss's office. It was not contested. There was no one left with standing to contest it, and Celeste had made clear from the beginning that she intended to honor what her father had intended, regardless of how long it took and how complicated the law made it. At the conclusion of that process, Iris was named a co-beneficiary of the Aldridge estate, her share defined by a structure that Daphne Voss had designed specifically to reflect Raymond's intent as described in his letter. The estate, all $85.3 billion of it, remained intact. It remained family. It remained, as Raymond had built it, in the hands of the people he had meant it for. Protected by the legal wall he had built in the winter of 2015 and by the daughter who had stood in a dark hallway and refused to be what she had been supposed to be. Ray Aldridge returned to Savannah for the sentencing hearing and then again for the estate resolution. He and Celeste began slowly and without any of the neat reconciliation that fiction would require to find their way back toward each other. It was not fast. It was not always comfortable. It was real. Which is the thing that matters about beginnings. Harold Briggs declined every interview request he received. He went fishing. He read novels. He remained, by all accounts, entirely at peace with what he had done, which was solve a case that had bothered him since the morning he read an obituary over coffee and thought, something convenient killed that man. Gloria May Trenton testified at trial and received, in the days following the verdict, more media requests than she had ever wanted or anticipated. She declined most of them. Celeste went to see her on a quiet weekday afternoon in December. She sat at Gloria's kitchen table, the third kitchen table in this story, and the most ordinary. And she held Gloria's hands and she said, "You didn't have to prove it. You just had to say it." Gloria cried for a long time. Celeste stayed until she was finished. 8 months after the trial concluded, and Celeste Wren Aldridge stepped down as CEO of Aldridge Global Holdings. She was 40 years old. She had run the company through the worst 2 years of her life, and she had run it well because she was her father's daughter, and she had never known how to do anything other than well. But she had also, in the months since the verdict, come to a clarity about what the company was and what she was, and whether those two things needed to be the same thing for the rest of her life. She put a leadership team in place, a team she had built herself, people she had chosen for competence and for character in equal measure, people she had vetted the way Raymond had vetted everything, which was thoroughly and without sentimentality. She retained her ownership position. She kept the board seat. She took a year. She traveled, not to escape, but to see. To be somewhere that had no Aldridge history, no family weight, no specific quality of air that carried memory. As she called Iris every week. They were not yet close in the way of people who have always known each other. They were close in the harder way of people who have chosen each other after everything, which is a different kind of closeness, and in some ways, a more honest one. She planted irises in the garden at the estate, in the bed that had been empty since Eleanor died, that no one had planted in for 30 years because Raymond could not bring himself to, and no one else had thought to ask. She planted them in the late fall, when the season was wrong for planting and the chance of them coming back in spring was uncertain. She planted them anyway. She had become by then someone who did things anyway, who did not require the certainty of outcome before she acted on something she believed in. She had learned that in the dark hallway, standing still while the floor gave way beneath her. She had learned it in the 72 hours, and she had learned it at the kitchen table in Brunswick with 2 cups of cold tea and a sister she had not known she had. You do not wait for certainty. You do the thing anyway. You plant the irises. You see what comes back. And so what do we do with a story like this? What do you take from it as you sit wherever you are sitting, at whatever time of day or night it is where you are? in whatever life you are currently inside. Because it would be easy, and not incorrect, to make this about the money. To say that $85 billion is what this story is about, and to note, with appropriate grimness, that the history of inherited wealth is full of exactly this. The circling of predators around enormous assets, the patience of greed, the way that proximity to vast money sometimes does something to people's sense of what is permissible. All of that is true. Cases like this one appear in court records across the country, in different scales and different settings, with different names and different compounds and different hallways. The pattern is older than any individual case. And the Slayer rule, the legal principle that prevents a person from inheriting from someone they have murdered, exists in 48 of the 50 United States precisely because this particular human impulse has been with us long enough that the law had to specifically address it. That is a sobering thing to know about human nature. It is also, in its way, a reassuring thing, because it means that the law has learned that every case like this one, in its resolution, teaches the system something, adds a precedent, builds a wall, the way Raymond built his wall, the way Daphne Voss built the new trust after the verdict. The law learns slowly, imperfectly, and expensively, but it learns. But I do not think this story is primarily about $85 billion. I think if you removed the money entirely, but if you made Raymond a man of ordinary means, and Marcus a man who stood to inherit a house and a modest account and a used car, the shape of the story would be the same. The hallway. The 4 minutes. The 72 hours. The woman who had every reason to fall apart and who did not fall apart. Those things have nothing to do with the number. Those things are about something else. They are about what a human being can hold and what a human being will do, and when the thing they love has been taken from them and the person responsible is still in the room. We talk about trust as if it were simply naivety, as if the people who give it are foolish and the people who exploit it are simply more realistic. But Celeste Aldridge is not the story of a naive woman. She is the story of a woman with her father's eyes and her mother's warmth, who extended trust as a genuine act of belief in another person's humanity, and who was met by something that wore the appearance of humanity but had discarded the substance of it. That is not naivety. That is the particular tragedy of the good faith that all functional human relationships require. We cannot live together without it. We cannot love without it. We take the risk every time, and most of the time, the enormous, overwhelming, statistically dominant majority of the time, the risk is returned with something that merits it. The tragedy is not that Celeste trusted. The tragedy is what that trust encountered. The lesson is not, do not trust. The lesson is harder and less comfortable than that. The lesson is, pay attention to what your body is telling you, to the feeling your father described to Daphne Voss on a night in January, over dinner, 2 years before he died. The feeling that something is performing authenticity rather than expressing it. He felt it. He chose to let it go. He chose his daughter's happiness over his own certainty. And that choice, the most human choice, the choice that love makes us capable of making, was the choice that cost him everything. We do not always get to act on what we know before it is too late, but we are always, always being told. The question I want to leave you with is this, not the dramatic one, not the courtroom one, not the question about whether justice was served or whether the sentence was sufficient or whether the legal system worked the way it was supposed to. Those are real questions, and they deserve real answers, but they are not the question that matters most. The question that matters most is the one that Celeste asked herself, alone in the car in front of a small house in Brunswick, Georgia, in November, before she knocked on a door she could not unknock. She asked herself, is it possible to build something true from the wreckage of something false? Is it possible to take what has been destroyed and find, in the ruins, the thing that was real all along and was simply buried? Her father believed it was possible. He made contact with Iris. He wrote the letter. He planted the seeds. He did not survive to see whether they grew. That is what she was sitting with in the car before she got out and knocked. And she decided, yes, it is possible. And she knocked. What do you think? Would you have knocked? Would you have stayed in that hallway? Would you have gone back to bed? Tell us in the comments. Tell us what moment in this story stopped you. What decision Celeste made that you did not see coming. What question this story leaves you asking about your own life and the people you share it with. We read every comment, every single one. And before you go anywhere, if this story meant something to you, if you found yourself leaning forward at any point, please do two things. Hit the subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.